Tonight we slip our sandals, yes, actual sandals, onto sun-baked stones in the middle of what seems like the world's most inhospitable place. The air here doesn't just feel hot, it shimmers. It's the kind of heat where you could, in theory, fry an egg on a rock, though you'd have to eat it fast before the wind turns it to sandpaper. The Persian sun beats down like it has a personal grudge, the light so blinding you find yourself squinting at everything, even your own hands. And yet, here you are, following the story of a king with the audacity to try to plant a garden here, a real one, with trees, running water, the works. You probably won't survive this without a large hat and a suspiciously good hydration plan. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see how far this little journey reaches across the globe. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The heat presses on your skin as you step forward, the air tasting faintly of dust and something metallic. Ahead, the king stands at the edge of a rocky rise, his white robes snapping in the hot wind. He's young, though the weight on his brow is heavier than the jeweled circlet he wears. This is no ordinary monarch, this is a ruler who has conquered not just cities, but the loyalty of people who whisper about his impossible vision, to carve a piece of paradise into the dry heart of the empire. It's the 5th century BCE, in the reign of the Achaemenid kings, and Persia stretches farther than you can comfortably imagine. But here, in a patch of barren plateau, even the empire's power feels like it could melt into the sand. If I can make flowers bloom here, the king says softly to his chief advisor, then I can make anything possible. Historians still argue whether this was genuine idealism or just a flex for visiting envoys, because nothing says I'm rich and unstoppable like planting roses where there's usually only scorpions. You take a slow step, feeling the gravel crunch underfoot. Around you, the landscape is a palette of baked ochre and burnt sienna. Even the sparse bushes look like they gave up on life sometime last week. Somewhere in the distance, you think you see a caravan, tiny dots on the horizon, but here, there's nothing but you, the king, and a vast silence occasionally broken by the screech of a hawk circling overhead. The king gestures to a plot of marked ground, a rough rectangle outlined by stakes and bits of cloth fluttering in the wind. This is where it will happen, where the desert will be tricked, bribed, and engineered into surrender. You can't help but smile, there's a kind of stubborn magic in the idea. Of course, stubborn magic often costs a fortune, and the empire's treasuries aren't exactly bottomless. That doesn't seem to bother the king. If the gods made this land empty, he murmurs, then perhaps they were just waiting for me to fill it. He isn't the first to dream of gardens in impossible places. You recall a quirky tidbit about Egyptian nobles keeping miniature pools filled with lotus flowers on rooftops, just to remind themselves of the Nile while they vacationed in drier provinces. This king, though, is aiming bigger. Instead of a few blossoms in a jar, he wants terraces, fountains, shaded walkways, and maybe even the sound of running water at night. You glance up at the sky. The light is so fierce it makes your eyes water, yet you feel a strange undercurrent of anticipation. The workers nearby are taking measurements, arguing over where to start digging. One squints at a papyrus scroll, another shades his brow with a flat palm. These are men who have built palaces, temples, and roads, but none of that compares to creating life in a place that actively tries to erase it. The king steps past you, his sandals kicking up a soft puff of grit. He talks of qanats, those legendary underground channels the Persians perfected to carry water from distant springs to thirsty soil. You can almost see the lines traced beneath the earth, secret veins ready to pulse with cool, clear water. First the water, he says, then the green. It sounds simple enough, though you know it's the kind of simple that will require an army of diggers, engineers, and enough stubbornness to outlast the desert's patience. For now, though, there's just heat. You run your fingers through the air, half expecting them to sizzle. A warm gust lifts the hem of your tunic and brings the faint smell of camel, meaning that caravan you saw earlier is getting closer. The king glances at it too, a flicker of satisfaction on his face. Those animals are carrying the first supplies, tools, timbers, and perhaps something wrapped in damp cloth to keep it alive. You take a step toward the marked ground, imagining it in the future, walls casting deep shadows, vines curling over arches, the air perfumed with jasmine and pomegranate. It feels like imagining snow in summer, possible only if you're willing to ignore reality long enough for someone else to bend it for you. Somewhere deep in the earth, water waits. The king will find it, the workers will drag it here, and maybe, just maybe, you'll stand in the shade one day, listening to it trickle past your feet. For now, you wipe the sweat from your brow and follow the king toward the arriving caravan, your sandals whispering against the sand. The caravan approaches in a slow, swaying rhythm, the camels' long necks bobbing like they're reluctantly agreeing to a bad idea. You can hear the faint jingle of bronze fittings, the occasional grunt, and the hiss of sand under heavy hooves. The closer they get, the more you catch sight of what they're carrying, bundles wrapped in damp reed mats, crates bound with leather straps, and long poles with little flags fluttering at the tips. The heat makes the air ripple so much that each shape seems to waver between solid and ghostly. Near the king, a group of men is deep in a conversation you can't help but eavesdrop on. Their voices carry over the open space, punctuated by emphatic gestures toward a series of sketches unrolled on the ground. These are the court's master engineers, architects, and a few lucky servants whose job is basically to hold the scrolls down so the wind doesn't turn them into flying carpets. The head architect, a wiry man with sun-leathered skin and the permanent squint of someone who's seen far too many horizons, points at a cross-section drawing. It shows a dark tunnel sloping gently downward beneath the desert floor, lined with bricks. Kanats, he says with the tone of a man repeating himself for the 10th time that morning. We dig from the highlands, follow the slope until we strike the aquifer, and gravity does the rest. Another engineer counters, yes, but the desert isn't a polite dinner guest, it's a thief. It drinks the water before it reaches us unless the channels are deep enough. Historians still argue whether these early debates were about practical design or about who would get the royal favor, and the bonus dates and figs that came with it. You lean in, glancing at the king, who seems to be enjoying the fact that his top minds are essentially bickering over how to pull off a miracle. One younger architect, his robe a little too clean, his enthusiasm a little too fresh, pipes up with something new. He sketches a tall, narrow structure with open slits at the top. Wind catchers, he declares, like in Yazd. Cool the air inside the buildings without wasting water. You can almost see the idea floating in the king's mind, a palace that not only has water but is cool enough to enjoy it without sweating through 3 layers of silk. You notice a scrap of gossip drift through the ranks. Apparently, one of the proposed designs includes a hidden pool where the king could float on hot nights, staring at the stars while servants fan him with palm leaves. A luxury detail, but then again, this whole project is a luxury detail on a continental scale. A quirkier tidbit surfaces. Someone mentions the legendary gardens of Semiramis, the queen said to have built impossible green terraces in Babylon. They say her flowers bloomed in midwinter, a scribe whispers, though he admits it might be an exaggeration. The king smiles faintly at the mention, as if he intends to outdo even myth. The camels finally kneel with their drawn-out groans, and handlers rush to unload them. You spot the precious cargo, sturdy bronze picks, ropes, reed baskets for hauling sand, and bundles of saplings, thin, pale, their leaves curled protectively. Even in their current state, they smell faintly of something alive, something green. One worker unwraps a crate of pottery jars, each sealed with pitch. He taps the lid of one, and a thin spray of cool water mists out. The crowd actually murmurs, "Water here feels like a guest from another planet." The king steps forward and dips a finger in, then flicks it toward the dry ground, watching it vanish instantly into the dust. Plans unfurl, both on the ground and in the mind. The engineers start marking positions for shafts, each one a vertical tunnel down to where the horizontal channel will run. Others walk the perimeter, planting little flags in the sand to show where walls might rise. The king's shadow stretches long in the late afternoon sun as he listens to each argument, nodding or shaking his head with the same calm, deliberate rhythm. You stand close enough to hear him murmur, "The desert will not beat me. It will serve me." The phrase is part threat, part promise. A sudden gust kicks up, flinging sand into everyone's faces. You blink it away, and in that moment you imagine the finished scene, trees swaying under the same wind that now carries grit, fountains splashing in courtyards where the sand once blew freely, shaded corridors where visitors will walk, marveling at the audacity of it all. Still, you can't help but think about the scale of the challenge. Digging through rock-hard earth with ancient tools. Hauling water across miles without spilling it into the thirsty desert floor. Convincing plants from distant, wetter lands to thrive under an alien sun. And, perhaps the hardest part, keeping the whole thing funded while other parts of the empire demand attention. The meeting of minds continues until the sun dips toward the horizon. The heat softens, shadows grow longer, and the first stars prick the sky. A decision is made. The digging begins at dawn, starting with the nearest highland slope visible in the east. The king gives a final nod, and the workers begin to set up camp, fires flickering, pots simmering, camels huddling together against the coming chill. You settle down on a rolled-up rug, the sand beneath you still radiating the day's heat. Overhead, the stars multiply, sharp and countless. Somewhere out there is the promise of water, cool and hidden, waiting to be coaxed into the light. By the time the first blush of dawn slides over the horizon, the camp is already awake. Fires hiss as kettles boil, the faint smell of cardamom drifting between canvas tents. You rub your eyes and spot the caravan handlers preparing for another day's trek, but this time, they're not hauling tools or water. Today's cargo is stranger, more fragile, living things that have no business being anywhere near this endless expanse of sand. The king is there, too, his robe tucked up slightly to keep it from dragging in the dust. He walks the line of camels like an eager child inspecting gifts, though each gift is a creature or plant that's traveled farther than most people ever will. The first bundles are unwrapped to reveal saplings, slender pomegranate trees from the empire's western valleys, their roots wrapped in damp cloth that's been kept cool with blocks of ice from mountain caves. You brush a finger over one leaf. It feels limp yet stubborn, like it's already preparing to fight for its life here. Behind them, larger crates are eased down from camel backs. Inside, the scent of rich earth hits you in a wave, the kind you almost forget exists after too much time in the desert. From one crate comes a riot of purple petals, violets, apparently brought from the lush gardens of Media. From another, a small cage with a pair of bright green parrots, blinking in the strange new light. A soldier beside you chuckles under his breath. "They'll think they've been exiled," he says, nodding at the birds. He's probably right, this landscape must look like punishment compared to whatever leafy paradise they came from. But the real stars of the morning are in the center of the caravan, a pair of creaking wagons carrying something hidden under heavy woven mats. The handlers remove them carefully, revealing rows of clay jars sunk into shallow pits of straw. You recognize the faint chirping and realize they're transporting small songbirds. Someone says they're nightingales, meant to fill the air with music once the garden takes shape. It's an oddly tender touch in a project otherwise defined by brute engineering. The king gestures for the birds to be given shade and water immediately, and you notice how even the most hardened guards treat them with surprising care. Maybe the thought of hearing birdsong in a place this silent strikes everyone the same way. It's proof that the dream might actually work. You trail after the workers as they unload the final living cargo, Clumps of mint and basil in clay pots, their smell sharp and fresh even from a distance. A cook explains they'll be planted near the palace kitchens to keep the meat from smelling like camel after 3 days. You file that one away as both practical advice and a reminder not to eat anything that's been in the sun too long. By mid-morning, the sun is a glaring white coin in the sky, and the caravan shifts into the shade of a low ridge. Workers spread woven mats to shield the plants from direct light, dousing the roots with precious scoops of water. Every drop feels like a gamble, too little and the plants die, too much and the supply runs short before the qanats are ready. Historians still argue whether these early shipments were carefully calculated or just optimistic guesswork. You suspect a little of both. There's a murmur of excitement as a final crate is pried open. Inside is a small fig tree, no taller than your waist, its branches heavy with green and purple fruit. The king plucks one, turns it in his hand, and offers it to you. You bite into the soft skin, the sweetness almost shocking after days of dust and salted meat. For a moment, the taste feels like the garden already exists, like you've stepped forward in time to its completion. A handler leads you to the edge of camp where the animals rest, and you spot another form of green hope, a single camel wearing a necklace of dried marigolds. The handler swears it's for luck, though a nearby scribe mutters something about marigolds warding off certain desert insects. Quirky, sure, but out here, even superstition gets a practical upgrade. As the sun reaches its peak, the king orders the caravan to move again, this time toward the half-dug shafts where the qanat teams have already begun their work. The journey is slow, the wagons creaking, the birds squawking every time the wheels hit a rut. You walk beside a camel carrying a crate of lemon saplings, imagining what they might look like in 5 years, their bright fruit catching the sunlight under a canopy of green. The desert doesn't make it easy. A hot wind rises in the afternoon, coating everything, leaves, feathers, even your eyelashes, in fine grit. Workers drape wet cloth over the most delicate plants, creating little cocoons that sway gently as the camels plod on. You keep one hand over your mouth to avoid inhaling more sand than air. By the time you reach the dig site, the light has shifted to gold, the long shadows of the ridge stretching over the first raw pits in the ground. The qanat entrances are still shallow, but you can feel a cooler breath rising from them, promising the water hidden deep below. The king directs the living cargo to be placed nearby, close enough for tending but far from the dustiest shafts. You help lower a cage of nightingales into the shade of a tent, the birds settling into a soft, uncertain quiet. You wonder if they'll sing tonight, or if they're waiting to sense the green around them before they begin. Either way, you feel the same, waiting, watching, hoping for the first real sign that this place can be more than sand and sky. The morning sun hasn't yet burned off the cool edge of night when you walk to the dig site. Even so, the air is dry enough to make your lips crack if you forget to drink. The workers are already a blur of motion, some bent over picks and shovels, others hauling baskets of sandy soil to the growing mounds at the edge of the work area. From a distance, the pits look like enormous anthills, the people tiny against the vast expanse of desert. You stop at the rim of one shaft, peering down into a perfect circle of shadow. The men at the bottom look like figures in a diorama, their voices echoing upward in bursts of chatter and the rhythmic scrape of metal against hard-packed earth. The head foreman, a stocky man with arms like woven rope, shouts instructions in a voice that somehow carries over the clanging. The digging of qanats is nothing if not relentless. Workers carve vertical shafts every 30 or 40 paces, then connect them with a gently sloping tunnel. It's an underground river system, invisible from the surface except for these breathing holes where hot air escapes and cool drafts rise. The Persians didn't invent the technique, there's evidence it existed earlier in Mesopotamia, but they perfected it, turning dry plateaus into farmland. Historians still argue whether this particular site was chosen for strategic water access or simply because the king liked the view. You watch as a rope pulley hauls up a reed basket heavy with soil, its sides worn shiny from constant use. 2 boys tip it over, the earth spilling in a cloud before it's shoveled into a growing berm. The smell of the fresh soil hits you dusty but tinged with a mineral coolness that suggests you're edging closer to the underground moisture. The king arrives mid-morning, his white robe bright against the ochre backdrop. He stands near you, looking down into the shaft. Like opening veins, he says quietly, to make the land bleed life instead of death. You can't tell if he's proud of the metaphor or just caught up in it. A younger worker nearby coughs in the dusty air and makes a joke about finding buried treasure before water. Everyone laughs, but there's a nervous undercurrent. This is slow, punishing work, and no one knows exactly when they'll strike the aquifer. There's an old tale, passed around the work crews, about a team that dug for 2 years only to find brackish water so bitter even camels refused to drink it. Still, progress is visible. At one shaft, the air drifting upward is cooler, carrying with it a faint smell of damp clay. The foreman's eyes gleam, and he orders the men to dig faster. You climb down a short way into another shaft, feeling the temperature drop as you descend. The walls are lined with bricks in some places, raw stone in others, the texture rough beneath your fingers. The tunnel at the bottom stretches away into darkness, its gentle slope leading toward the unseen source. A lantern flickers ahead, casting shaky shadows on the low ceiling. You crouch to follow the sound of scraping tools. Down here, the world feels muffled, your breath louder, the workers' voices blending with the distant drip of water you can't yet see. The air tastes faintly metallic, as if the earth is whispering about what it's hiding. When you climb back into the daylight, a breeze has picked up, fluttering the flags marking future walls and pathways. The king is conferring with the architects again, this time about building small holding pools to store the first water that reaches the surface. One suggests lining them with bitumen to keep the liquid from seeping away, another proposes stone basins that could double as decorative fountains later. The king listens, his gaze fixed on the pits as if trying to see through them into the hidden network below. A quirky moment breaks the tension. A worker pulls up a clump of earth and finds, of all things, a small, petrified snail shell. It's passed around like a relic, proof that this place might once have been wetter than anyone remembers. The king keeps it in his palm for a while before slipping it into a pouch at his belt, a little token of hope. By late afternoon, the shafts are deeper, the air rising from them unmistakably cooler. The foreman grins as a damp smear appears on the wall of one tunnel, and a cheer ripples through the crew. It's not a gush, more like the shy arrival of a guest, but it's enough. The first moisture. The first promise. The king orders the news carried back to camp, and for the first time, you see him truly relax. He doesn't smile broadly, he's too careful for that, but his shoulders drop, and he closes his eyes for a heartbeat, just breathing in the dust and the wind like they've suddenly become allies. You linger at the edge of the work site as the light turns honeygold. The mounds of soil cast long shadows across the sand, and the cool air from the shafts drifts upward in gentle waves. Somewhere, beneath your feet, water is beginning its long, slow journey toward the place where green things will one day grow. The first thing you notice the next morning isn't the sun or the heat, it's the smell. Not strong, not yet, but different. The air carries the faintest trace of damp earth, like someone spilled a cup of water on hot clay and the scent is lingering. You follow it toward the shallow holding pool near the canat mouth, where a trickle of water collects in a basin lined with stone. It's not much, barely enough to wet your hands, but the way everyone's staring at it, you'd think it was liquid gold. The king stands nearby, hands clasped behind his back. Now, he says, we plant. He doesn't mean the final trees or the decorative vines. Those are still months away. What he's talking about are the first test patches, small squares of damp earth where workers will coax life out of soil that hasn't felt roots in centuries. You kneel beside one such square, running your fingers over the surface. It's a rich brown now, darkened from its usual pale dust by repeated watering. A team of gardeners is carefully pressing seeds into the furrows, barley, lentils, and a few hardy herbs. If these sprout, the ground will be ready for more delicate arrivals later. Historians still argue whether this early planting was purely practical or a symbolic gesture meant to boost morale. Either way, it works. Nearby, a gardener unwraps a bundle of onion shoots. Fast growers, he explains. They'll tell us if the soil is good or cursed. You're not sure whether he's joking, but when he sticks one shoot into the earth and pats the soil around it like a sleeping baby, you decide not to ask. A quirkier sight catches your eye, a row of clay pots filled with a damp, mossy mixture. Inside each is a sprig of mint, kept alive through the journey. They're set in the shade of a low wall, watered with almost comical reverence. For the kitchens, a cook says, grinning. If the king can eat lamb with fresh mint sauce out here, he'll believe anything's possible. The work is quiet, rhythmic. A man scatters seeds from a woven pouch, another smooths the soil with the flat of his hand. Children run back and forth carrying tiny jars of water, sloshing only a little on the way. The king steps between the plots, his robes brushing the young shoots. You can tell he's resisting the urge to kneel down and plant something himself. This is work for specialists, and he knows better than to meddle. By midday, the heat is relentless, but the planting continues. The gardeners rig up makeshift shades from reed mats, leaning them over the plots so the seedlings won't fry before they even break the surface. You help carry a mat into place, and for a moment you stand in the dappled shadow, imagining it multiplied 1,000 times across the whole planned garden. Someone nearby tells a story about the hanging gardens of Babylon, how they supposedly had a machine that lifted water up to high terraces without spilling a drop. The details are vague, but it sparks an idea in the king's eyes. He murmurs to one of the architects, who starts sketching a system of pulleys and counterweights on a scrap of parchment. Whether it will work or not is another question entirely. As the sun dips lower, the first oasis in the making takes on a strange beauty. The plots are small, but the dark, damp soil stands out sharply against the endless pale sand. You notice how the smell of wet earth has grown stronger, mixing with the sharp green tang of crushed mint. The sound of trickling water from the holding pool is constant now, faint but steady, like the garden's heartbeat. A small crowd gathers when the first bird, a sparrow, not one of the imported nightingales, lands on a stake marking the edge of a plot. It tilts its head, pecks at the soil, and flies off. The gardeners take it as a good sign. If the birds believe, one says with a grin, maybe the plants will too. Evening falls, and the workers gather to eat under the new shade mats. The king joins them briefly, accepting a cup of barley water from the same jar used to wet the seedlings. He drinks without hesitation, then sets the cup down in the dust. Tomorrow, he says, we dig more, plant more. There's no grand speech, just a calm certainty that the desert's days of ruling this patch of land are numbered. You stretch out on a mat, the scent of damp soil clinging to your skin. In the distance, the nightingales rustle in their cages, still silent, as if waiting for the green to grow before they open their throats. You close your eyes, hearing the steady drip of water into the pool, and for the first time, the dream of a lush garden in this place doesn't feel impossible at all. By the time the next moon cycle begins, the dig site has transformed into something entirely different. The rows of test plots still sit in their shaded corners, but now the sounds of chisels and hammers ring through the air. You follow the noise to the edge of the main clearing, where workers are laying the first stones of what will become the palace, the heart of the king's desert paradise. It begins modestly enough, foundation trenches filled with large blocks of limestone, dragged here by teams of oxen. The stones are pale and rough-edged, but in the sunlight they almost glow, as if they've been waiting centuries to be part of something grand. You run your hand over one, the surface warm from the morning heat, and imagine the walls that will rise above it. The king's architects swarm over the plans like bees over honey. They argue about which courtyards should face the prevailing wind and how high the main audience hall's ceiling should be. One particularly dramatic man insists that if the roof beams are even a finger's width shorter than a tall man's reach, the entire structure will feel wrong. Historians still argue whether these flourishes were artistic genius or just ego with a blueprint. As you wander between the foundations, you hear a faint hum from the nearby Kanat outlet, water being channeled into the site for mixing mortar. The mixture smells of wet clay and crushed limestone, and the workers shovel it onto flat boards before slapping it between stones. The rhythm of stone laying is hypnotic. Lift, position, check the line, wedge, tap, repeat. A quirky touch catches your eye. One of the masons has pressed a small seashell into the wet mortar of a corner block. When you ask why, he grins and says, "So the palace remembers the sea." It's a strange little nod to a world far from here, and you make a mental note to check if it's still there once the walls rise. The pace is astonishing. Columns take shape from stacked drums of stone, each one carved with shallow flutes that catch the light. Temporary wooden scaffolds climb upward, filled with men passing tools and shouting warnings. The smell of fresh-cut cedar from the mountain forests drifts through the site, beams for the ceilings, their resinous scent oddly comforting in the dry air. The king arrives mid-afternoon, trailing a small entourage of advisors. He stops in the shadow of a half-built wall, looking up as if already seeing it complete. "Marble," he says suddenly. The architect blinks. "For the audience hall floor. Polished until it reflects the ceiling. You can't help but glance at the sand all around. Marble here will be as foreign as snow, and just as hard to keep clean. Still, you suspect that's exactly the point." By evening, the outer shape of the palace begins to emerge. Wide gateways stand like teeth against the horizon, framing views of the desert beyond. Workers carry in heavy wooden doors bound with bronze, their hinges creaking as they're fitted. From one side of the site, the sound of chisels grows sharper, stonecutters carving reliefs of date palms, lions, and curling vines into slabs that will one day line the walls. The first hints of shade appear where partial walls meet. You step into one such corner, letting the coolness pool around your ankles. The shift is remarkable, just a few degrees cooler, but enough to make you think of sitting here in the heat of summer, listening to the splash of a fountain while the wind hisses outside. A team of builders is already setting the frame for what will be the central courtyard. They've staked out space for a long reflecting pool, fed by water from the Kanat. The plan is for the surface to mirror the night sky, doubling the stars overhead. One mason tells you the pool's edge will be lined with blue-glazed tiles, the color of deep water you can never drink. Not all is smooth progress, though. A section of wall collapses when a load-bearing stone shifts unexpectedly. No one is hurt, but the king orders extra time spent checking each foundation. "We're building for centuries," he says, "not for the next season." His tone makes it clear that perfection is not optional. As dusk settles, the site is lit by dozens of oil lamps. The half-built palace throws strange shadows across the sand, turning the skeleton of the building into a maze of light and dark. You linger at the edge, watching the glow reflect off the limestone and thinking how, in time, this will be the heart of a garden, a place where visitors will step from searing sunlight into cool, fragrant shade without quite knowing how they got so lucky. The workers begin to sing as they pack up for the night, a low, steady rhythm that seems to blend with the desert wind. Above, the stars emerge, and for the first time you can imagine them mirrored perfectly in the pool that doesn't yet exist. The palace, like the garden, is still a promise, but one you can now see rising from the dust. By the time the palace walls rise high enough to throw real shade, the air in the half-built courtyard smells different, no longer just limestone and dust, but faint threads of sweetness drifting from the far side of the site. You follow the scent past scaffolds and stacks of timber until you find the source, a patch of imported blossoms, their petals trembling in the warm breeze. The king is already there, kneeling beside a gardener who's arranging potted flowers like pieces in a board game. The blooms are pale pink, deep red, and buttery yellow, each one carefully labeled with a clay tag pressed with the plant's name in Old Persian. When the king leans close to smell one, the gardener gives a small, satisfied nod like a chef whose dish has just passed the royal taste test. Perfume, the king says when you approach. Not just for the air, but for the people. He explains that certain flowers will be placed along main walkways so their scent mingles with the breeze, greeting guests before they even see the fountains or the pools. You can't help thinking that the right perfume might make even a sweaty trek through the desert feel luxurious. The air is already heavy with promise. Gardeners unroll reed mats soaked in rosewater to keep the blossoms from wilting, and a group of servants prepares small packets of petals for the palace women to wear in their hair. A quirky fact emerges in conversation. Apparently, some of these flowers are the same varieties used in ancient love potions, though whether the king knows that is unclear. Historians still argue whether these planting choices were deliberate or the result of whatever the traders happened to have available that season. Not far from the floral beds, another kind of scent wafts through the air, spiced meat roasting over charcoal. You wander toward it and find a shaded corner where merchants have set up temporary stalls to feed the workers. Skewers of lamb, flatbreads brushed with sesame oil, and bowls of pomegranate seeds glisten in the fading light. It's not just food, it's politics. The king makes a point of eating here sometimes, among the masons and gardeners, rather than in the temporary royal tent. It's a quiet way of reminding everyone that the garden is for the whole court, not just for him. Later that day, you overhear a conversation between two advisors leaning against a half-finished colonnade. One mutters about the cost of importing sandalwood for the palace doors, the other whispers about a visiting envoy from Lydia who was so dazzled by the construction that he forgot to argue over trade tariffs. It clicks for you. The garden isn't just a vanity project, it's a political tool, a scented, sunlit way of saying look what I can do to both allies and rivals. The king joins a group of musicians in the courtyard as evening approaches. They sit cross-legged on woven mats, plucking lutes and tapping frame drums, their melodies weaving through the air like smoke. A servant moves among them with a shallow brass bowl, scattering saffron-infused water that releases a golden mist. The musicians grin as it drifts over them, the scent of spice mingling with the music until you can't tell which is making your head feel light. You find yourself leaning against a still warm wall, watching the way the day fades here. The desert light shifts from white to amber, and the shadows stretch until they seem to touch the very edge of the horizon. Workers carry the potted flowers into sheltered alcoves for the night, their petals glowing faintly in the lamplight. Somewhere, a deal is being struck in low voices, promises of grain shipments, perhaps, or new trade routes. The king passes you as he heads toward the royal tent, pausing for just a moment to glance back at the flowers. A kingdom should smell like something worth keeping, he says softly, almost to himself. Then he's gone, his robe catching the last gold of the sunset. You linger in the courtyard, letting the breeze bring you stray hints of rose, jasmine, and sandalwood. For a moment, the palace is quiet except for the rustle of petals and the faint crackle of the cooking fires. You realize that this, too, is part of the magic, the way scent can settle into memory, making the desert feel like it's already been tamed, even if the sand is still only one good windstorm away from reclaiming everything. The next phase of the king's desert dream rises not from the ground, but from the air above it. You first notice them in silhouette at sunrise, tall, slender towers with strange open mouths at their tops, like the chimneys of some upside-down ship. The builders call them badgers, wind catchers, and their purpose is to steal cool air from the sky and pour it into the sweltering rooms below. You wander over to where one is nearly complete, its mud brick walls smooth and pale against the morning light. A crew of masons is fitting thin wooden slats across the tower's interior, angled to funnel wind downward. When the foreman spots you peering in, he grins and waves you closer. "Go ahead," he says, "stick your head in the opening." You do, and the difference is instant. Cool air brushes your cheeks like a secret breeze that shouldn't exist in this place. It smells faintly of clay and wet mortar, a scent that reminds you of riverbanks far away. You can't help a small laugh. It's like finding winter in a box. The king arrives not long after, his expression uncharacteristically boyish as he tilts his face toward the opening. "A garden should be more than water and green," he says. "It should be a place you can breathe." The architects nod, clearly proud, though historians still argue whether these towers were adapted from earlier Egyptian designs or invented here by necessity. Down below, the system is even more clever. Narrow shafts carry the cool air into storage rooms and shaded corridors, while vents on the opposite side of the palace let hot air escape. In some spots, the wind catchers connect directly to channels of moving water, so the air is chilled further as it passes over the surface. You imagine sitting under one on a scorching afternoon, hearing the faint burble of a fountain while the air moves across your skin like silk. A quirky side note emerges from the construction crew. Apparently, one mason swears the towers will also keep away flies. His reasoning is that the constant breeze will blow them back outside before they can settle. You're not convinced, but it's a pleasant thought, especially since the kitchen is just across the courtyard from the largest wind catcher. By midday, the sun beats down so fiercely that stepping into any of the unfinished rooms feels like slipping into an oven. Then you duck into a chamber with its wind catcher already in place, and the change is staggering. The air here is not just cooler, it's moving, whispering past your ears, carrying with it the faint sounds of hammering from outside. You lean against the wall, tempted to just stay until nightfall. The king uses this moment to walk the half-built halls, trailing his fingers along the cool plaster and imagining the future. You follow him into a room meant for guests, where he gestures toward a high, arched doorway. When they step in, he says, they'll feel it before they see it. That will tell them we've mastered this land. You realize he's right, there's a kind of psychological victory in making the desert air itself seem friendly. Later, as the workday wanes, a small gathering forms in the main courtyard. The musicians from the last section are back, their notes mingling with the gentle sigh of air from the new towers. The gardeners bring in pots of basil and mint to sit near the vents, so the breeze carries their scent into the palace corridors. It's an unexpectedly luxurious touch, the kind of detail that makes you forget you're in the middle of a wasteland. The workers finish the last wind catcher just before sunset. From the roof, you can see the line of them like sentinels, each facing a slightly different direction to catch every possible shift of wind. The king climbs up beside you, the desert stretching endlessly in every direction. For a moment, there's no sound except the sighing air slipping through the towers, as if the land itself is exhaling. When you climb back down, the rooms feel different. They're still bare stone and scaffolding, but the air moves around you in a way that makes you imagine silk curtains fluttering, lantern flames bending, and guests sighing with relief as they step inside. The garden may still be only half planted, but already, the palace can breathe. The night the first banquet takes place, you almost forget you're in the middle of the desert. From the palace roof, the garden below glimmers with pools of lamplight, each flame mirrored in the still water of narrow channels. Musicians tune their instruments in the shadows, plucking and testing strings that hum like dragonflies. Somewhere, the clink of ceramic dishes mixes with the low laughter of servants preparing for the flood of guests. When you step into the great courtyard, the air is warm but soft, carried through by the new wind catchers. Long carpets run between the fountains, their patterns a dizzying mix of flowers, vines, and abstract shapes that seem to shift as you walk. On low tables, Trays of food wait under silk covers, dates so dark they gleam like polished stones, figs split open to reveal honey-pink centers, and round flatbreads dusted with sesame. The king is already seated at the far end, leaning back on embroidered cushions. His robe tonight is deep green, stitched with tiny golden pomegranates that catch the lamplight whenever he moves. You take a place near one of the musicians, where the scent of roasted lamb drifts closer with every passing servant. As the evening unfolds, the menu feels like a test of what the desert will tolerate. Bowls of pomegranate seeds arrive alongside fresh grapes, brought in by camel caravan just the day before, followed by slices of melon that must have been grown in carefully guarded irrigated plots. A historian at the table leans over to tell you that melons like these were once reserved for royalty alone, and whether the seeds came from India or were cultivated locally is still a point of scholarly bickering. You're halfway through a platter of almond-stuffed dates when a servant places before you a dish of something unexpected, bright orange carrots glazed with honey and sprinkled with crushed coriander. A gardener sitting nearby whispers that the carrots were grown here, in the new garden's experimental beds. Proof the soil will listen, he says with a grin, though he admits half the crop came out so twisted they had to be boiled for soup instead. The musicians shift into a slower rhythm, and a storyteller takes a seat near the king, spinning a tale about a mythical bird that can cross the desert without once landing. The story is woven with humor. At one point, the bird supposedly stops midair to complain about sand in its beak, and the laughter from the guests feels like another form of victory. After all, here they are, comfortable, well-fed, and amused in a place where, not long ago, there was only wind and dust. The quirky moment of the night comes when one of the court poets insists on reciting verses about the new windcatchers. His poem compares them to giant mouths sipping the sky, which draws an appreciative chuckle from the king and a few scandalized looks from the older nobles. You suspect the line will be remembered long after the exact menu is forgotten. By the time the main dishes are cleared away, the stars have claimed the sky above the courtyard. The king rises and leads a slow walk through the garden, past fountains where oil lamps float like tiny suns on the water's surface. He pauses now and then to greet guests, slipping in bits of politics as easily as compliments about their robes. Deals are being made here as surely as the lamb was roasted earlier, grain exchanges, troop agreements, trade privileges, all sealed with the easy warmth of a shared meal. When the procession returns to the banquet tables, the final course awaits, small clay cups of chilled yogurt flavored with rosewater, each topped with a single mint leaf. You take a sip and realize how absurdly luxurious it is to taste something cold in the desert at night. It's the sort of moment that locks itself into memory, not because of grand speeches or lavish jewels, but because of the quiet perfection of it. The musicians strike their final notes, the guests drift away, and you remain for a while in the cooling courtyard. The wind catchers breathe softly above, the garden smells faintly of mint and rose, and the moonlight turns the fountains into sheets of silver. The desert is still out there, waiting, but tonight, inside these walls, the king has made it bow its head. By daybreak, the garden is alive with more than just people. You wander through the pathways and spot the first movement, a flash of coppery brown in the shrubs. A gazelle steps out, delicate legs barely making a sound on the packed earth. Its ears twitch toward the rustle of a gardener carrying a basket of herbs, but instead of bolting, it simply watches, chewing slowly, as if deciding whether humans are worth the trouble. The king has decreed that his paradise should be filled not only with plants but with animals that remind visitors of the far corners of his empire. This means the garden is now part menagerie, part diplomatic statement. In one corner, a trio of peacocks strut beneath the shade of a fig tree, their feathers spilling color into the dusty morning light. The birds are almost too perfect. When one cries out, the sound is surprisingly harsh, like an old gate swinging shut. Near a small pond, a pair of white swans glide in slow circles. A servant tells you they arrived in giant clay jars filled with water, each swan fed by hand for the entire journey. Historians still argue whether swans were actually native to the Persian royal gardens or whether this was a rare indulgence, but either way, it's the kind of extravagant detail that makes the king's guests gasp. You pass a pen where a stubborn ibex, the same one rumored to have chewed through the ropes of its own transport, stands glaring at a groom who is trying to coax it toward the shade. The ibex wins the standoff by sheer refusal to move, and the groom sighs in defeat. "He'll come when he wants," he mutters, and you suspect that might be never. A gardener leans in to share a quirky tidbit. Apparently, one of the peacocks has developed an obsession with the windcatcher vents. Every morning, it struts to the palace wall, fans its tail, and stares into the breeze like it's expecting applause. Nobody knows why, but the king finds it amusing enough to let it be. As you wander deeper, you realize the animals are placed with intention. The gazelles graze near the outer edges, the birds cluster near water features, and smaller creatures, hares, doves, even a few desert tortoises, move in the quieter corners. It's as if the king has designed not just a garden, but a living painting. Every turn of the path reveals a small scene, framed by greenery and stone, lit by shifting sunlight. The palace staff has learned to incorporate the animals into daily life. Gardeners drop leftover leaves into the gazelle's reach, kitchen scraps go to the ibex, and the swans get a special mix of grain and herbs. There's even a young servant whose sole job is to follow the peacocks with a broom, an unglamorous but necessary role. During the midday heat, the garden quiets. You sit in the shade of a pomegranate tree, listening to the faint splash of a fountain. The swans drift lazily, the gazelles rest in the shadows, and somewhere out of sight, the ibex is probably still ignoring instructions. The air smells faintly of basil from the nearby herb beds, and for a moment, it's easy to forget the walls beyond the garden are the only thing standing between all this and the desert's hunger. In the afternoon, the king strolls through with a group of visiting envoys. He gestures toward the animals as he speaks of trade routes, water rights, and alliances. "Even here, where the earth resists, we can nurture life," he says, a phrase that could be about politics as much as about gazelles. You watch the envoys nod, their eyes following the peacock's jeweled tails as though they're already picturing these sights in their own lands. By sunset, the garden feels transformed. The air cools, the animals stir, and the fountains catch the orange glow of the sky. The gazelles begin grazing again, the peacocks climb to roost in the fig tree, and the swans make one last slow circuit of the pond before tucking their heads beneath their wings. You linger, watching the shadows stretch and merge, until the animals are no more than shapes in the dim light, a reminder that this desert garden is not just human ambition, but a shared home for all its residents, stubborn ibex included. It starts subtly, just a change in the way the guards stand at the palace gates, a sharper glance exchanged between two soldiers in the shade. You walk past and hear snatches of low conversation, too quick to catch all the words, but one phrase is clear: gold for flowers instead of steel. By the time you reach the garden's central fountain, the murmurs are impossible to ignore. The banquet laughter, the gleaming windcatchers, the swans in their pond, all of it costs silver and labor that, some say, should be pointed toward defending the borders. The empire's neighbors are restless, and there are stories of raids in the far provinces. Yet here, in the heart of the desert, the king pours resources into perfecting the curve of a marble bench. You sit near a group of off-duty soldiers sharing a water skin, their voices low but steady. One insists the garden is a stroke of genius, a symbol of abundance to intimidate enemies. Another snorts, pointing out that symbols don't stop arrows. Historians still argue whether such dissent was common or carefully whispered in these times, but you can feel the unease simmering beneath the formal courtesies. Later, you overhear a court official trying to reassure a visiting trader. The king knows what he's doing, he says, but his tone is tight, and he glances over his shoulder before continuing. The garden is more than a pleasure ground, it's a statement of control over nature itself. The trader only nods, perhaps thinking that nature is not the only thing needing control. The quirky twist in all this tension comes from an unlikely source, the ibex. Sometime during the week, it has developed the habit of wandering into the construction yard and knocking over stacks of unused bricks. Workers now joke that the animal is a rebel at heart, protesting the king's building projects. Someone even ties a strip of cloth to its horn in mock solidarity. The guards don't find the joke nearly as funny. When you pass the fountain again at dusk, you notice fewer guests lingering in the open. Conversations huddle in corners, and the musicians play softer, as if to avoid drawing too much attention. The swans glide in the lamplight, serene and oblivious, but the people are restless. One evening, the king calls for a gathering in the main courtyard. He arrives wearing simple robes, no gold thread, no jeweled belt, and speaks directly to the crowd. A garden is not built in a day, nor is an empire defended by fear alone, he says. His voice carries in the warm night air, and you can't tell if he's speaking to soothe the rebels or to remind himself. He promises new investments in the military while insisting the garden will continue. We can have both beauty and strength, he declares, though whether anyone believes that is harder to read. Afterward, the music resumes, but the mood is different. You watch the guests sip their rosewater drinks a little more quietly, eyes flicking toward the palace walls. Somewhere beyond those walls, riders carry news of raids, negotiations, and troop movements. In here, the desert breeze carries the scent of basil and mint, but the scent of doubt is just as present, lingering like the faint aftertaste of pomegranate on the tongue. The first sandstorm of the season doesn't announce itself with drama, just a faint dimming of the light, as if someone has hung a thin cloth over the sun. You're in the outer garden when you notice the horizon turning the color of baked clay. A gardener looks up, squints, and mutters something about the desert coming to visit. Within minutes, the breeze sharpens into a push. Dry grit begins to bite at your skin, and the swans on the pond shift uneasily, their reflections breaking into ripples. The air changes flavor, dusty, metallic, like an old attic left open too long. Servants hurry past, rolling up carpets and covering food stalls with oiled cloth. You duck under a colonnade just as the wind roars in. The sound isn't like normal wind, it's deeper, a muffled, constant growl, like the ocean caught in a jar. The king's much-praised wind catchers do their work, funneling a cooler breeze into the palace halls, but even they can't keep the fine dust from finding its way inside. Historians still argue whether such storms were predictable seasonal events or erratic monsters, but standing here, you can see why people might have thought of them as living things. From the safety of a covered walkway, you watch the garden disappear into a moving wall of sand. The date palms sway wildly, and the peacocks, normally so proud, have crammed themselves under a stone bench, tails folded tight. Somewhere, you hear a servant curse as a clay jar shatters. The ibex, naturally, is nowhere to be found. Later you'll hear it had already taken shelter inside the storage sheds, uninvited but perfectly comfortable. Hours pass in a strange twilight. The king remains visible only briefly, striding through the inner halls to reassure guests. It will pass, he says, and you realize this isn't his first sandstorm by far. Still, there's a flicker of tension in the way he glances toward the walls, as though measuring the garden's resilience in his mind. The quirky moment of the day comes when a young kitchen servant tries to deliver trays of rosewater yogurt to the inner courtyard, refusing to admit defeat to a little wind. He emerges into the storm wrapped in 2 layers of cloth like some sort of pastry, only to be blown sideways into a column. Miraculously, the cups survive intact, though he ends up with a mouthful of sand and a round of applause from the other servants. By late evening, the roar softens. The sand settles in lazy swirls on every surface, turning the once bright garden into something ghostly. Fountains trickle again, but the water is cloudy. The gazelles step cautiously back into the open, nibbling leaves as though nothing happened. The peacocks shake themselves out, sending little clouds of dust into the air. You step into the center path and realize this is the garden's true test, not its beauty when the air is calm, but its survival when the desert reminds everyone who's in charge. The marble benches can be scrubbed, the channels cleared, the flowers replanted. But the idea, that stubborn seed the king planted in the heart of the desert, has to prove it can root itself deeper than any sandstorm can reach. The storm has barely cleared when the palace starts humming with a different kind of energy, preparation. Rumors swirl faster than the sand ever did. A caravan of dignitaries is on its way from distant lands, and they're not just passing through. They're here to see the garden everyone's been whispering about along the trade routes. You watch as gardeners bend to their work like artists racing a deadline. They sweep sand from the walkways, polish the marble edges of the fountains until they gleam, and replace wilted blooms with fresh ones from the shaded nursery. The king wants perfection, which means even the peacocks get a bath, something they resent loudly. One attempts a slow-motion escape down a side path but is scooped up by two determined handlers. Historians still argue whether such diplomatic garden tours were more about trade, politics, or simple showing off. Standing in the middle of this whirlwind, you can see it's probably all three. The garden is a theater, and every leaf, ripple, and feather is part of the performance. On the morning of their arrival, you're stationed near the main gate, pretending to study the date palms while secretly sizing up the guests. They come draped in fabrics dyed in colors so rich they seem to drink the sunlight. Gold-threaded belts catch the light, tiny bells jingle with every step of their camels. The air fills with the smell of foreign spices, cinnamon, saffron, something smoky and sweet. The king greets them at the central fountain, standing in the exact spot where the water arcs highest. He sweeps an arm to take in the view, the flower beds glowing with color, the shaded pools shimmering in the breeze, the swans gliding like actors hitting their marks. A servant offers trays of pomegranate juice so chilled the glasses sweat. There's a quirky interruption when the ibex, clearly aware of the unusual attention, ambles into the path and stands squarely between the guests and the herb garden. It stares, chews something invisible, and refuses to move. One dignitary actually laughs, calling it the true ruler of the garden, which the king takes in good humor, though you notice a guard gently shooing the animal away moments later. As the tour continues, the dignitaries run their hands over the smooth stone walls of the channels, peer into the basins of clear water, and marvel at the way vines have been trained to weave through trellises. The king points out rare plants brought from the Caspian coast, medicinal herbs prized in distant provinces, and fruit trees heavy with figures. You hear one guest murmur to another, "If this can grow here, perhaps anything can." The garden works its magic. Conversations shift from polite greetings to talk of alliances, mutual defense, and trade deals. It's impossible to say whether the flowers or the political convenience are more persuasive, but either way, agreements are written in the cool shade of the pavilion, with the sound of water in the background. As the sun dips low, the guests are served dinner right there in the garden. Oil lamps flicker, turning the paths into rivers of gold. Musicians play soft, steady rhythms. The peacocks roost in the fig trees like exotic ornaments. Even the air feels rehearsed, cool, fragrant, deliberate. And though you know the sand still waits beyond the walls, ready for its next attempt, tonight it feels very far away. You wake to a day so perfect it feels staged. The sky is a flat, flawless blue, without even the thin whisper of a cloud. The heat has not yet reached its noon sharpness, and the garden hums quietly with life, the splash of fountains, the chatter of finches in the fig trees, the low rustle of palm fronds in the breeze. The king walks the central path ahead of you, his pace unhurried for once. Today, there are no storms, no restless soldiers, no urgent whispers from the court. The canals are running clear, every channel precise and full, carrying water like veins feeding the body of this place. Even the swans seem to glide slower, as if savoring their own reflections. Historians still argue whether this period, the garden at its full bloom, lasted a few seasons or several years. Some records hint at decades of careful upkeep, while others suggest the moment of perfection was brief, stolen almost immediately by politics and weather. But right now, standing here, you can believe in forever. The flower beds are an explosion of color: saffron yellow marigolds, deep red roses, violet irises, and delicate white jasmine. The air is so thick with scent it feels like you could lean on it. Fruit trees bend under the weight of figs, pomegranates, and dates, and a few figs have fallen to the ground, sweetening in the sun until bees claim them. In the pavilion, a group of musicians plays a slow, hypnotic melody. A poet sits cross-legged nearby, composing verses aloud about the triumph of man over nature. You catch a few lines, something about the desert bowing to the king's will, and wonder if that's entirely true. Nature doesn't bow, it negotiates. A quirky moment breaks the tranquility when the ibex reappears wearing what can only be described as a decorative garland of herbs around its neck. You suspect the gardeners didn't put it there voluntarily, as several of their mint plants are conspicuously missing. Visitors gather to take in the sight, some laughing softly, others sketching the animal as though it were an intentional part of the display. By late afternoon, the sun turns the marble warm under your hands, and shadows grow long across the paths. The king hosts a leisurely banquet under the wind towers, the cool air carrying the scents of roasted lamb, honeyed pastries, and freshly baked bread. Courtiers lounge on carpets, sipping chilled sherbet, while foreign envoys murmur about trade in low, pleased tones. It feels unshakable, this oasis of calm and abundance. You lean against a low wall, letting the water's murmur fill your ears, and almost forget there is a desert beyond the high, sunlit walls. But you've been here long enough to know better. The sand doesn't stop being the sand, and the wind doesn't stop dreaming about the things it can bury. For tonight, though, the dream of the king's garden belongs entirely to him and to you, as you walk its quiet paths under the fading gold of the evening sky. The first sign isn't dramatic, it's subtle. A whisper of wind that rattles a few dry leaves, a trickle in one of the smaller canals running slower than usual. You crouch beside the water, dip your fingers in, and feel the faint warmth of it. Not the cool, lively current you've come to expect. Somewhere upstream, the lifeline is weakening. The king notices too. His walks through the garden are longer now, slower, with pauses at every fountain as if he's listening for something only he can hear. Servants report cracks in the outer channels, stones loosening under the relentless cycle of heat and cold. Historians still argue whether the decline came from political turmoil, shifting climate, or simply the impossible cost of maintenance, but in the moment, it feels like a living thing fading. A meeting is called in the pavilion. Engineers speak in low tones about repairs, but their hands draw in smaller and smaller shapes on the plans, as though they're shrinking the garden in their minds. Courtiers suggest diverting funds from other projects, but there's resistance. The empire's borders are restless, and the treasury has limits. Still, life goes on. The jasmine blooms, though less thickly. The swans glide, but their pond needs cleaning more often. And in a moment of almost comedic resilience, the ibex takes up residence near the fig trees, eating the ripest fruits before anyone else can harvest them, as if determined to enjoy the garden's bounty to the last. One evening, a gust of wind carries in more sand than usual, settling over the paths like a pale veil. It's not a storm, not yet, but it lingers. Over the weeks that follow, the layer thickens. A bed of roses becomes a mound of grit with a few stubborn petals. A marble bench vanishes halfway into the dune's edge. The king doesn't give up easily. He orders new crews, repairs, and even fresh plantings. But each victory is smaller, each repair a little less thorough than the last. Guests still come, though fewer, and some leave with polite but distant praise. The garden remains beautiful in parts, but the perfection you once walked through is now scattered in fragments, like a dream remembered in pieces. And then one morning, you wake to silence. No trickle of water in the nearest channel, no rustle of gardener's tools, no scent of baking bread drifting from the pavilion. The wind carries only the dry smell of sand. You walk the main path, its edges blurred where the desert has begun to reclaim the stones. The high walls still stand, but they feel like the edges of an island shrinking into the tide. In time, even those walls will vanish, and travelers will pass through without knowing that once, here in the heart of the desert, a king coaxed rivers to run where none should have flowed, and blossoms to open where none should have grown. As the last petals fall in our story, the garden begins to blur not just from the drifting sand, but from the edges of memory itself. You step back from the path, letting the air brush your face. The sun is softer now, lower in the sky, painting the dunes in layers of gold and shadow. The desert is patient. It doesn't hurry, it simply waits, folding over what was once alive, turning marble to dust and water to whispers. The garden, though fading, is not truly gone. It lingers in the smell of jasmine still caught in the air, in the faint echo of music you almost think you hear when the wind curves around a broken wall. You imagine future travelers crossing this place without knowing it, their camels padding over stones worn smooth by centuries. Maybe they'll find a fragment of carved marble, or the root of a tree long turned to stone, and wonder who built such things here. You turn once more toward the heart of the garden and see it as it was, green, alive, full of cool shadows and the sound of water. A vision, yes, but one that feels as real as the sand under your feet. The king's dream, though the desert reclaims it, is not lost. It has simply shifted from earth to story. And as the light slips further toward night, you let the image fade, carrying the memory with you. The wind is softer now, the air cooler. Somewhere, in the hush, the desert exhales and the garden sleeps.